Hello everybody, welcome to the National Football Museum's Create the Space event in partnership with the Football Supporters Association. I'm really pleased that you can be here today. My name's Belinda, I'm a curator at the National Football Museum, but I'm going to hand straight over to Anita, who will introduce herself. She's our fantastic host for the evening. I really hope everybody enjoys the discussion.
Belinda, thank you so much. So hi everyone, I'm the guilty party for the few minutes that we're starting this a little later. I don't know why, I don't really have any excuse, but my camera was acting up. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for joining us for yet another edition of Create the Space. As Belinda mentioned there, it's brought to you by the National Football Museum and the Football Supporters Association. So we're all here this evening because on Sunday, it marks a huge date in women's football history. It's 100 years since the FA made the decision to ban women's football from its club stadiums. Now, in terms of this evening, I'm going to be talking a bit now, but you will hear from the lovely other guests in the room that you can see on your screen. So whether you're tucking into some dinner or you got a cup of tea or a drink of wine, please do enjoy, because I hope for this next hour it will be as much fun as it is educational as we mark that special date in women's football's history, as I said. So in terms of the discussion today, I think we've got a very strong five-a-side team for you. So starting with the top right corner, we're joined by Carol Thomas, a former England captain. To Carol's left, we have Professor Jean Williams. She's the author of a very in-depth book that looks at the history of women's football. In fact, it is called History of Women's Football. And if you've not read it, I do thoroughly recommend it. It looks at the early stages of football from the Victorian era right through to what we're living and seeing now. Belinda already introduced herself. She's representing the National Football Museum, and she'll be giving us that insight into how women's football's history has been documented over the years. Then below Belinda, we've got Deb Dilworth, who is the women's game lead at the Football Supporters Association. And then next to Deb's, we've got Liz Ward, the Director of Programming at Stonewall. If you're not familiar with Stonewall, they're Europe's biggest charity that really support and help get out the rights for the LGBTQ plus community. So I hope I've done them justice. I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes because it'd be great to hear why our panelists are so keen on women's football. And I think the best place is probably to start with Carol Thomas, because you actually made the headlines recently, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Hi, yes, a great surprise. Last week I was down at St George's Park to watch, as I thought, just to watch the Lionesses training, and I was surprised by my induction to the National Hall of Fame, which was tremendous. A great surprise, yeah.
And for those that don't know, Carol, of course, you were the first woman footballer to reach 50 caps as an international player, and you also captained the first England team to a European final. So I think it's no surprise as to why you were inducted into the Hall of Fame. Jean, it'd be great to hear from you next, please.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. My background is that I used to play football, not to any level such as Carol. Anybody who plays football, I used to get awarded things like most improved player. So, which is basically what you give people for encouragement rather than being any good. But fortunately, I'm much better as an academic than I am as an actual football player. So I've been writing about the history of women's football for 20 plus years, and I've worked for the likes of FIFA and UEFA. And it's taken me all over the world. So it's been very good to me, the world of women's football.
Yeah, we'll come to Liz now, if that's possible.
Yeah, hi everyone. Wow, what a panel. I feel very, very honoured to be alongside you all. Yeah, really incredible moment for me personally. So my name's Liz. I'm Director of Programmes at Stonewall, as Anita said, Europe's biggest LGBT organisation. I think, you know, what does women's football mean to me? Gosh, it means the whole world, right? I'm a football fan, have been ever since I could remember. Played football all the way through childhood and then stopped playing for a while. Because I think, you know, sometimes all the things happen when you hit puberty, and I didn't feel able to play the game for a while. And now I play for Gold Diggers Football Club. I'm sporting the shirt tonight. You're able to see it. And it's just brought me back that love of playing football as well. So I don't know about most improved, but definitely it's improved my love of football for sure. So yeah, and it's amazing to be able to work on Rainbow Laces, which we're currently in the middle of. So that's what I do with my work hat on as well.
Yeah, the Rainbow Laces campaign is all across the Premier League. We've been seeing it for some years, and also the captain's armband tends to have those lovely colours. Debs, let's come to you. Let's hear about the Football Supporters Association.
Yes, so we've got Women's Game network of supporter groups across England and Wales. And that's been going for about a couple of years. And I just want to say as well, I'm just so stoked that this event is happening with the National Football Museum. I love women's football. I play, I coach, I've refed a little bit. And I did a master's dissertation on women's football and education, the role of education for women's football. So, you know, I'm just hugely passionate about this area, and I'm delighted that we've got this panel together tonight.
And then making up the five-a-side is Belinda. Belinda, tell us about your role at the National Football Museum.
Yeah, so my journey into women's football has been a bit topsy-turvy really, in that I wasn't interested in it at all. And then I started working at the National Football Museum quite a long time ago, but my interest was in social history and women's history and working class history. So the National Football Museum for me was always like the natural place to work. And I started working with the women's football collection and basically just fell in love with it. And I absolutely adore working with the collection at the National Football Museum. What I've been doing the past few years is we're trying to build up to 50% representation for women in football across what we do at the National Football Museum. So a lot of my time is actually spent working with women that have played in the past or play now to really make our collections more representative. And it's just, I absolutely loved every minute of it, to be honest, because I get to do panels like this, I get to work with people like Carol and Jean, and you know, just really capture all those really rich histories and stories. So a bit of a different journey into women's football, but now that I know the history, I'm hooked, basically.
So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is 100 years on since that landmark decision. And we're going to be getting into the various areas that decision has impacted. I think you can see from our five-a-side that we're well covered here. So you're going to have the historical context, you'll have what it meant for women's rights at the time, the supporter side of things, and then first-hand personal experience. So expect a great chat here amongst us. It's not going to be some formal question back and forth. But in terms of the personal side of things, Carol, you're the one I'm looking to first. You mentioned there that you were inducted into the Hall of Fame just last week. First of all, what did that recognition mean to you, and when did you actually start representing England?
Yeah, it meant a great deal. As I say, it was a great surprise and just a great deal for the women that played in the at the beginning, at the end of the ban, in the early 70s and early up to the 80s, after the ban was lifted. I always say, we like to think of ourselves as pioneers of getting the women game up and running again, and hopefully the present lionesses appreciate what we did, because had it not been for us, I don't think they'd be where they are today, to be quite honest.
That word you use, pioneer, is a word that's associated with many women that played in your generation. I mean, being amongst the present lionesses as you were at St George's Park, did you get a sense that they have appreciated the trials and tribulations that you and your fellow teammates went through?
Yes, I did actually. It was a lovely surprise. They all came over and congratulated me and thanked me for what not only myself did, but the women of that time. It was yes, I think they really appreciate what we've done for them now. Yeah.
You mentioned the ban. Of course, it was put into place in 1921 and then was lifted some 50 years in 1971. And I mean, Carol, your career is a testament to the progress that we have seen in the women's game. I think it'd be great to hear from either Jean or Belinda now, if you could just kind of paint a picture for us of what football was like, or how accessible it was for women before the ban. So maybe in those 10 years or so leading up to 1921.
Do you want to go, Jean?
Both of you go for it.
How very British after you.
I know. Well, I think the part of the ban that most people sort of recognise or know about, and I think Jean would agree with me, is the munitionettes teams. So the teams that built up around munition factories during World War One, and there was suddenly a boom in female participation in football because of that, running right up to the end of the war, and then afterwards when you start to get quite large crowds watching women's football.
When you say large crowds, give us a number.
Well, at the Football Museum, we did a bit of research recently, and we think that the biggest crowd that was a Ditka ladies, they were probably the most famous, best team of that generation, played St Helens at Goodison Park, and they attracted about 46,000 people. And it's really, really difficult to get an exact number, probably impossible. But if you consult the minute books of Everton Football Club, the number is around 46,000. Some people said in the low 50s, but either way, that was a huge number of people to be watching a women's football match. And that was just prior to the ban coming in 1921. So although women have been playing football since the late 19th century and probably earlier, you do get that boom just around the First World War, and that's probably what people know about that period most of all. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Jean?
All that I would add is that women's football started out as a professional sport. This is something that people don't really know. So back in 1881, the first matches were professional matches. You know, we think we haven't got a paper trail, but what we call as historians the cumulative evidence points to the fact that the players were paid, and it was designed in 1881 as a paid entertainment, as matches would be. And bear in mind that the Football League doesn't start until the 1880s. The men's professional football league doesn't start until the 1880s. So it's really important to say that where women's football is now in terms of professionalisation is where it started from. It's not a new dawn for women's football. That's where it started. And the other thing that I always challenge, and I hope anybody on this call who's joined this call would also do, is women's football is not in its infancy. It's not in its adolescence, because it's 150 years old, and you cannot have a 150-year-old baby or a 150-year-old teenager. So women's football is really a little old lady, and what we don't know is that hidden history, and that's the work that I often do with the likes of Belinda and players like Carol to bring out those fantastic stories.
That's quite remarkable, because you used the word infancy there, and I think I in the past have been guilty of using that as well. When you're talking about the progression we're seeing now, we're saying, oh, it's the early stages, but in reality you're saying we were way far ahead before, took about 100 steps back, and now we're just about getting somewhere close to where we were in those 1800s. Debs, do you know what the situation's been like with fans and so on, and how they've appreciated women's football, be it before the ban or during the ban at all?
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on Jean's point, because a lot of people say, oh, support is new in the women's game as well, and it's absolutely not. And there's loads and loads of figures to back that up. So I'm going to just credit one of my supporters trusts here, Huddersfield, who have done an awful lot of work on heritage in and around the city, who said every football team or every community has a Dick Kerr lady. So actually there's incredible history in and around every community, and big numbers, bigger than some football league teams now. So I think what's interesting, the supporters movement has been going on about 100 years. So it's actually the 100th year anniversary of the supporter activism or a supporters organisation this year as well. So I'm interested in sort of exploring more about, as the supporters movement became a group, actually something very devastating was happening in the women's game, and how did that cross over? But actually there was quite a lot of support through the ban. Players were still trying to play when they could. Depending on what you class as a supporter, which is pretty much anybody, mums, dads, siblings, aunties, uncles, friends, there was support all the way through. It might not have been structured. So what we have at the FSA now, or what I've tried to create along with my amazing women's game supporters groups and support from the EFL ones, is this structured approach and having constitutions and rules, but actually it's happened all the way through. It just might have been in a bit more of an informal way. So you've always had that supporter activism in the women's game. It's just not been as structured. So yeah, I would definitely agree with Jean that actually supporting the women's game is a 150-year-old woman as well.
So I think anyone who's tuned in to today's chat should immediately ban those kind of words from their vocabulary when talking about the women's game. That's something I'm learning now. And then looking at the wider context, or I guess really when we get into that ban, how does that come about? Because you use the word ban. I don't know, thinking of recent times, we were banned from leaving our houses last year during COVID. How did that actually play out from 1921 then?
Do you want to go, Belinda, or
go for either?
I'll start if you want. So it's not a ban on women kicking a ball. I think that's it's a ban on women's teams playing on the grounds of clubs that are affiliated to the Football Association, and a ban on refereeing women's matches. So what it does, and I'm using a phrase here from Jean's book, is it marginalises the women's game, and it pushes the women's game underground, and they suddenly lose the places that they've previously been able to play football in front of huge crowds like Goodison Park. So women do still keep playing football. It's just that it can't become a structured game in the same way that the men's game can, because of the restrictions that are placed upon it. So that's sort of the immediate effect of the ban. And I'm sure Jean will agree with me in this. The ban doesn't sort of come out of the blue. So obviously at the end of the war, women sort of almost pushed back into roles that they had fulfilled prior to World War One, so working and playing football, and there's a general view in society that women sort of need to go back to the home and to doing what they were doing previously, and the ban on football almost comes out of that that shift, that movement towards women going back to their own spheres of influence, I guess. And there's always been some negativity towards women playing football. That's evidenced in the newspaper cuttings from the late 19th century onwards. So that has always been in the background. It's quite blatant misogyny often, and that's still playing out in the 1920s. And I think what fascinates me still is that it was able to be put into force without any large-scale resistance, really. So women themselves resisted by continuing to play, and there were people who obviously disagreed with it and wrote newspaper articles and wrote to the FA and disagreed with what was happening, but there wasn't any large-scale resistance. And I think that's really interesting in itself, and that wouldn't happen if it was to happen today, for example.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is just think about what you know now, and you can physically see this whether you live in a village, a town, a city, or wherever, is that you will know about men's football because there will be a pitch nearby that you drive past or get your train past or whatever every day. At the time when the big men's clubs were being established, think about it, in the 19th century, there were things called Married Women's Property Acts. So women were not allowed to own property. Once they got married, whatever property they owned was their husband's. So women did not have access to buy large plots of land to build football grounds. So they were always reliant on the established infrastructure of the men's clubs on which to play their football. And suddenly what you get with this ban, because all of the clubs in the Football League were affiliated to the Football Association, as well as all the little boys clubs and the local clubs and everything else. So women, it was impossible for women at the end of World War I to buy a plot of land and establish a football club to contest the ban. They just didn't have the resources to do that. And that's why the ban has been so powerful, because it created a myth straight away in 1921 against what we already knew, which is it makes it look like women's football is not spectacular, or not as spectacular as men's, because it moves on to parks. They played in Borstalls. They had to play on places where you couldn't encircle the ground and charge the public to enter. So it made it look like something that had to move around, and women just didn't have the resource to build their own grounds and pitches. And so even coming down to the WSL today, and I can see from the chat, I know we've got quite a few WSL fans on here today, that's what we're dealing with now. That's why Manchester City women have to play at Man City. It's why a lot of the Super League clubs will play on grounds affiliated to men's clubs, because they don't have the resource to build their own.
So from what I'm hearing, essentially that ban was a reflection of the women's role in society, or the woman's role in society at that time. It was almost like an extension. So you touched on the fact that she didn't have rights to bank accounts, etc., because she was essentially property of her husband, and that's how football falls into this. So it wasn't actually anything out of the extraordinary when you think about it. It was simply a reflection of the times. You used the word, I think it was, they were marginalized from society. And everyone, thank you so much. I can see so many comments. I meant to say, if you have any questions, please do send them for the panelists. We will get to them at the end of the conversation. I'd love to bring you in, Liz, because there may be people who have never felt marginalized in their life, or they're not quite sure they understand what that means. So are you able to just give us a bit of context of how someone may feel marginalized in a football environment?
Yeah, that's oh gosh, there is so much to reflect on here. And for me, growing up in the 90s in St Helens, struggling to find a football team to play in after St Helens and those surrounding areas have such a rich footballing history, is it speaks to that marginalization, right? The systemic breaking down of a group of people, of an existence that comes right from the institutions that surround it. So you can't thrive. It's like every time you're trying to pop up, someone's whacking you down again. And the legacy that has left, when I think about when I was really obsessed with football, when I was about, from 5, 6 years old, 8, 9 years old, getting noticed, even playing academy a little bit. And when I was starting to get more serious in it, and I wanted to play football really, really seriously, there's nowhere for me to go at the time. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. So I started playing netball.
And
that's what my school drilled me into, because we didn't have a school.
Yeah.
We didn't have a girls' football
because
team.
It's considered a girls' sport. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, and so it sits with you, and it exists, and it continues. And I think that when I think about people that continued fighting both in 1921, when I think about you, Carol, being that vanguard back then as well, and everyone around you and after you, I think, wow, that it was hard in the 90s, and I couldn't do it, and so I cannot imagine how hard it must have been then. And I think about playing now today. And, my amazing football team, Gold Diggers, like an incredibly, diverse team, well-resourced, there's loads of members. We struggled to get a pitch space for so long. And most grassroots women's football teams in London, women and non-binary people, struggle to find a place to have a kickabout when it gets late, early, dark nights. There's no floodlights, struggling still for that space. And it's that legacy piece. It's just devastating, really, isn't it?
And in your role, have you established the solution? Of course, we'll come back to women's football and how it's progressed, but I'm just keen to hear about, in your role, is there a solution? What could we all maybe do to try and make it better?
So it's interesting, like we have worked with the Premier League since 2017. We've only really worked with women's football teams in the last kind of year and a bit, really. So our focus has been very much including LGBT conversations and identities within the men's game and football more widely. And yet when we look to the women's game, we know that is a conversation that's already being had. Lots of players are out, lots of players talk about it. It's far more accepting space to grow up, to exist within. But the things that we're starting to put in place right now is that we work with all the WSL teams with their academies. We have sessions where, alongside the life skills programs, to help train up these young people going through the footballing world. But I think it also has to come wider, doesn't it? And the more that these young players are having a focus and are starting to have a platform and starting to have scrutiny, I think the more that their identities will be under the spotlight too.
Carol, so you, of course, are one of the pioneers in the game. The ban ended in 1971. Liz used a really interesting phrase there, saying creating accepting spaces. When you first started to get into the game, was it an accepting space? Did you feel you could be yourself?
Yes, luckily in Hull, where I first started, I was only 11 when I first started playing ladies football. But we had our own local league. They were all mainly works teams like Reckitt's and YEB. So we were just based in Hull, which was quite lucky. But we did have to play on park pitches. And we said about spectators, it was all family, one man and his dog. We was just grateful for anybody turning up. But playing in Hull, I think I was quite lucky for my start up to my football career.
And during that time, were there any? I mean, it's hard to imagine because, of course, we're so connected now. You can find inspiration or sporting heroes just through going on a social media platform. So forgive me if the question sounds a bit silly, but were there any female footballers that you could look up to at that time?
No, none whatsoever. No. Once we got up and running, possibly Flo Bilton, who was a great stalwart of the WFA, as it was known when we got going. She worked at Reckitt's in Hull, and she really got the Hull League up and running. So possibly Flo was the person I looked up to, yeah. Because back in the day, again, in the 40s it would be, she would play ladies football.
And it's worth just adding in, Belinda and I had a reunion at the National Football Museum in 2018, and we just threw it open. So anybody who had played women's football before 1993, that was the only criteria. And that was absolutely fascinating because we were joined by England internationals like Jill Coulthard, the great Kerry Davis, the great striker Kerry Davis. And we had a team who come along who played in the unofficial Women's World Cup in Mexico in 1971.
I was hoping you'd...
The Lost Lionesses, who have gone on to get their recognition 50 years later. But the England team players of the 90s had not really heard of the Lost Lionesses. And then we had another team, Manchester Corinthians, the oldest player of whom, Alice Elliott, started playing age 14 in 1949. and the 71 team had not heard of the women of the Manchester Corinthians. And Manchester Corinthians had toured South America, for instance, for 3 months in the 1960s. They were an incredible side. If we talk about Dick Kerr, Manchester Corinthians are the kind of modern day version of that. And again, football took them all over the world. So it was really interesting to have these women in the room, all of now my age or older, and they had not heard of the other generations because there wasn't that connectivity, and they were only hearing those stories much later in their lives.
So essentially a lack of information and also structure stifled the progress even then, because you've spoken about these incredible teams that achieved such feats, but they didn't even know that they've been around. And so I guess they're always looking to themselves for that inspiration, maybe. Looking to, I guess, the fan side of things again, Debs, when we emerge from that ban, is there an appetite for women's football in the 70s and 80s when Carol would have started to play?
I think there would have been an appetite, but again, it was in a context where there was lots of disparaging comments around women's football and people being extremely rude about
could
it.
Could you maybe delve into that without, of course, hopefully we don't cause anyone any offence, but just to give us an idea of what those disparaging comments would have been?
Disparaging comments around women not being able to play, all based on why it was banned effectively, you know, the body type, not being clever enough, smart enough, fast enough, physically able enough, whatever it was. I mean, I think, you know, even today we see often loads and loads of comments and commentary around women's games that are on TV, or, you know, in the men's stadiums or wherever it's so the ban really is still in effect, in some senses, in affecting people's minds about the beautiful game and women playing it. You know, and it's I mean, I know a lot of people on this call would be highly frustrated with some of the comments that are being made, but this is where I am just adamant that I need to do more reading and research. Jean or Belinda might be a bit more well read on this, but I think that there was still a common amount of people throughout the country watching and supporting women's football. Even Carol, actually, you know, looking around, you know, you said one man and his dog, but actually, like, that one man and his dog is someone, and that is a supporter. So, you know, you've also got people that are supporting but doing lots of different roles within a football club, but at the end of the day they are still a supporter. So I coach 2 women's teams. I coach a beginners side with women that have never played, of watching them. I support them while I coach them as well. So I do think that the supporters within the women's game, they were always there. It's just it's easy to say, oh, WSL has been around for 10 years and we've only had these supporters for 10 years. But, you know, if you've grown up playing football, your mum and dad have come and watched you play or whatnot, they are supporters as well as your family. I don't know, Jean and Belinda might be able to answer a bit more around the history around that time.
I think it's about community. I don't know if I think you just touched on it there a little bit, Debs, is, you know, there's always been a community around women's football, and I think arguably the ban made that stronger, and it's still there. So the supporter isn't always the same supporter that you see going to a men's Premier League game, but it's a fan of the women's football is often the person who plays, coaches, makes the kit, does absolutely everything, basically. So it's a slightly different form of support, I guess. Sorry, Jean, I interrupted you there.
No, I'd absolutely endorse that. I used to play in the East Midlands League with a woman who I was thinking about while Deb was talking, and she got 4 kids, and her support was her husband and the 4 kids who would come along every week and support Mum, who was a brilliant player, by the way. And you know, it was their whole family day out was around Mum playing football. And again, phenomenal for that. But just go back to the ban. And again, the other thing that I always address, and I've seen some really, really poor market research come out recently, that that I've been on social media about around women fans of the women's game, which is there is an assumption, and it's really, really being pushed by a lot of the football bodies, that women's football has to be a family audience because it's women, right? So who's going to be interested in women, children, and other women? And we know that statistically that's not right, that a lot of the men who are fans of the women's game are the men who are very turned off by the Premier League kind of football and the money and everything that goes with that. And they prefer a more, as they perceive it, authentic football, kind of non-league level football. And the women's game for them is that kind of authentic game because the players are much more accessible. It's not all about the money, it's about various other things. And the final thing I'm going to add on fandom is going back to the ban, that at the point at which the ban came in 1921, the fans of women's football were the ordinary men who turned out week in, week out to pay their money. They could have gone and watched other forms of football, but they came along and paid their money to support the women's game. So again, the idea that we are making progress in fandom by getting incrementally larger audiences to the WSL is a nonsense. Women's football used to speak to that football fan who turned out week in, week out. And we're still not there with it yet because it's not being presented in a way that people can access it.
Anita, sorry, I was just going to add to exactly what you just said. So in terms of the family audience and those kind of elements, we do repeatedly say and talk about in our Women's Game Network meetings the fact that actually there's a lot of adult women and men that really enjoy the game, and it shouldn't just be this family friendly kind of cleansed version of football, because that's the other thing as well, is whether or not the women's game and then the players as well as the fans all have to have this higher moral compass than the rest of football in order to survive or be liked, or so I think it does present. It was just wanted to pick up on Jean's point, because I think that really is important about what the women's game is. And a lot of people are surprised with the activity that we've been doing this year. So we did an event at FC United with Clapton, and we were talking to people at supporters about the ban and just trying to share the history. And I think people were surprised about the support, about the ban, but also the fact that people were paying. They were literally paying to watch women play. And there's this whole myth around that, oh, well, they watched, but it's got to be free. And it's absolutely not correct. And so, yeah, fandom, I would totally agree, is not new, and people were paying.
Yeah, and the best way to sell it is to make it expensive, make it a premium product. Don't go, we're going to fill the stands by giving away loads of free tickets to kids, because it makes it seem like a throwaway product. And that's been proven in various tournaments like the 71 unofficial Women's World Cup. You sell it big and you sell it as aspirational, and people buy into that story. And that's where I think some of the branding around the WSL, and I think some of the market research, like I said, the findings of this market research were that there will be no economic benefits to any of the pubs where women's football is held, because women don't go into pubs when they go to the football. Well, if you've been at Women's World Cup in France in 2019, the buvets were absolutely full, and guess what? We were all having a beer and talking about the football. So fans of women's football are not that different than fans of men's football. It's just people liking good football.
I'm glad you mentioned the unofficial World Cup of 1971, because for those who aren't familiar with it, it's an incredible story, and it leads to this phrase of the team, the unofficial England team, being called the Lost Lionesses. Belinda or Jean again, could you maybe just tell us briefly a bit about that? Because of course England's emerging from this ban, and these young girls at the time are used to playing in their park, as Carol said, in front of a man and his dog, and then all of a sudden they're thrusted into stardom halfway across the world in Mexico, and we see the blueprint of what could be women's football in the future.
Go on, Jean, you know them better than I do. I'll talk a little bit about what we've got on display at the Football Museum afterwards if you want. That might be a good way to do it.
So this is such a fantastic story that at one point, and bearing in mind that when I did my PhD 20 years ago, nobody was talking about women's football. I used to go and find older women and sit in their front rooms and go through their memorabilia with them and try to piece together a PhD like that. So, and I'd heard about this thing in 1971 and it seemed like it was massive, but we couldn't get any footage of it and we couldn't get any documentation. And we kind of thought that we'd maybe made it up. We'd maybe exaggerated how big it was and how significant it was. And then the players got in touch again through this reunion hosted by Belinda at the National Football Museum. And the memorabilia was immense. So it was hosted in Mexico in 1971, the year after the Men's World Cup had been hosted in Mexico. The players stayed in the same hotel as the England team. So you've got 14 and 15-year-old girls who had gone from the park with one man and his dog, who were staying in the suite that Bobby Moore had stayed in the year before. They were fated. As soon as they got off the plane, one of the players turned around and said, "There's somebody famous on this plane," because there were crowds at the airport for them just to arrive. And when they looked around to see who the famous people were, it was them. And they had their own TV crew follow them for the whole month. They had their own print journalist follow them for the month. They had receptions at the ambassadors' ball and they went to, TV shows and they had parties and they did this and they did that. And in between all that, they played football in front of crowds. We think the England team played in front of crowds about 80,000, wow. But the final in the Azteca Stadium, which was sold just in the way that a men's football match would be sold, was, we think, 110,000. And if people Google it, there is some footage from a Danish TV website, and you can see the size of the crowds. You can see the opening ceremony. It was just absolutely massive, and it was sponsored by Martini and Rossi, the drinks company, who provided the cup, which was won by the Danish team. So it was absolutely massive, and I would argue a way of selling a Women's World Cup that didn't even happen in France 2019. So the final in 2019 in France was in Lyon. Why wasn't it in the Stade de France? Yeah. Why did the French Football Federation have the confidence to go, we're going to go big, we're going to go premium, we're going to go aspirational, and put it in their national stadium? So Women's World Cups are still not being sold in the way that was in 1971, which makes it very interesting for historians.
Right, so I think that gives us a great idea of where things came from in the lead up to the ban, during the ban, and then just following it. Carol, give us an idea of what it was like playing during the 80s and 90s, so moving a bit closer to today.
Yeah, well, I retired in 85, but one of our greatest achievements was getting to the final of the first ever UEFA competition for women's international teams in 84. And we played Sweden over a two-legged final. We lost 1-0 in Sweden. We won 1-0 on a bog of Kenilworth Road, which it would not have ever been played today. But unfortunately, we lost on penalties. We did have a bit more newspaper coverage and media coverage, but not an awful lot, even in 84, to be quite honest.
And of course, you were playing football as a hobby, right? This was a hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a full-time job, so I used to work 9 to 5, do extra. When I was playing for England, I used to do extra training after work on a night. travel to York twice a week because I was playing at Roundtrees at York at that time, and then play games on the weekend as well. All our own expense. We didn't get any expenses or anything. We paid a lot of money to represent our country, to be quite honest.
And how does that make you feel, saying those words?
I'm proud. I'm proud of the women of our era that we did that. There's no jealousy. I'm really pleased for the women playing today because it just shows the way that the women's game has moved on, and a lot of the women are now professional, semi-professional. There's no bad feelings or jealousy or anything, to be quite honest.
And this theme of it being funded by the player who wanted to do it continued through the 90s as well. I'm keen to hear from someone, at what point does it start to change and it started to be viewed as something that could actually be a profession like it is in the men's game?
In terms of the England team, the first central contracts were in 2009 for a group of players so that they didn't have to work full-time and represent England. So it's incredibly recent in terms of the national team, at least. I don't know.
12 years. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know a great deal about the payments that Jean was referring to back in sort of the late 19th century. But you get sort of the end of the 90s first requests to the PFA, the Professional Football Association, from teams saying, if we want to have a professional women's team, can you sort of represent them as professional football players? So it's very, very recent history in terms of the contemporary game, and when women basically see football as a job, as work, so that they don't have to pay to play or take on work outside of football as well.
And Carol probably knows. I mean, certainly Carol played with Terry Davis, who went over to Italy to become a professional. I don't know if you knew Anne O'Brien, Carol, but certainly British players. Anne O'Brien was Irish, and obviously the great Rose Riley, who we have to talk about in every conversation about women's football ever. She went over to Italy to play professionally, and in many ways Rose Riley became more Italian than the Italians themselves, took Italian citizenship, and she actually won a Mundialito, a Women's World Cup, as the captain of Italy. So women had to leave England if they were going to be professionals from the late 60s up until Kerry Davis was in the 1980s, I think, wasn't it, Carol? 1980s, 1990s. So it's a very recent thing. And that came about, the Women's Super League basically came about because of Hope Powell, who saw, again, back in the day, England used to beat USA. I have to say, the players of Carol's era were phenomenal. They were phenomenal players. If they were playing today in the setup that there was today, we would be talking definitely about winning World Cups. They were phenomenal players, no doubt about it. So back in the day when we used to beat USA, and then you could gradually see the USA getting better and better and better. And Hope Powell says, if we're ever going to address this, we need to have the WSL, and we need to have regular high-profile games within England, and that's the recent nature of the change.
For anyone who's not familiar with Hope Powell, she's the current Brighton manager, former England international, a real trailblazer in the women's game, and especially when it comes to black female British players as well. I can't believe that we're like at the final last 7 minutes. This has been so informative, and thank you so much to everyone who's sending in questions. Liz, this one is for you, I think. Do you think the ban had any impact on the accessibility of football for people who have traditionally been marginalised and excluded from engaging with men's football? So, for example, the LGBT community or people of colour.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say undoubtedly, right? I think that having a ban already marginalises people, and therefore the most marginalised within those people will struggle to come through. I mean, it's a question that I'm asked quite a lot, actually, which is why are our current Lioness squads so lacking in diversity when we compare that to the men's game? And it's probably because the legacy of women's football still now means that the access needed to keep at it, to keep playing, to go to training, to go to sometimes far out training camps or stadiums or academies that are away from where you live, and not having great infrastructure to get there, and that American collegiate pathway still being quite real in the game as well, that people feel they need to go to America and train there, and that cuts off a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, for sure. The interesting one around LGBTQ plus identities, I think, is that the other question that I probably get asked a lot is why are so many people in the women's game able to live their true self and be out and proud compared to the men's game? And so I wonder, I don't know if the ban necessarily had a legacy there, but if you're already fighting for pitch space and you're already fighting to survive, then fighting for who you love probably just becomes part of the course as well. And yeah, just to echo what people have said about Hope Powell, she's one of the many legends of the game that's featured on this GDFC merch that Belinda helped us put together at GDFC, and yeah, is an incredible vanguard of modern coaching as well. I think maybe the only black female coach in the WSL and even the championship below, potentially. So yeah, incredible to see her, and I'm glad she got a shout out tonight.
To add to that, Megan Rapinoe, I'm sure we all know who she is. In the World Cup last year, she said a line, I think, that probably resonates with anyone who's familiar with the game. She said that you can't win a championship without gays in your team. It's never been done before, ever. That's science right there. And so we know it's the case. I guess it's acceptance and letting people be their true selves. Debs, I've got a question for you. So what has been your greatest achievement in all the work that you've done so far for the women's game? Because I know you're going to be doing so much more.
Oh, that's a hard one. I think, well, I love my supporters groups, and I'm really proud of the fact that we now have a network for the women's game, which can lobby on a local and a national level to make sure that supporters and supporters' voices are at the heart of decision making. So we recently, some people might be aware of this on the call, but the fan-led review was announced recently, and they've announced that there's going to be a separate review on the women's game. And I think this really is going to be a massive moment to try to make sure, or hopefully avoid, the many mistakes that have been made in the men's game. Not to make it so that the women's game is on a higher moral compass, but just to make sure that it's protected, it's sustainable, and that supporters and that community are at the heart of some of the biggest decisions. Because we've seen some crazy moments in the men's, which are changes to shirts, changes to stadiums, relocating teams. I'm really just delighted with all the supporters groups and the work that they're doing on a local level, and all credit to them. The one piece of work that I have loved recently was the work that we did to celebrate supporters. So we the FSA gifted all of our women's game supporters groups a flag which said over 100 years of supporting the women's game, and all of our supporters had pictures taken with the flags, and it was just a real celebration of supporters in the game and acknowledging what the ban has done to supporters as well as to the players, as well as just celebrating all the trailblazers. So yeah, that's the bit of work that recently, and I think the National Football Museum, we sent them a flag as well. So we're hoping to keep making little dents in the history too on a supporter perspective. And
I think with recent events in football, we've seen the power of supporters with the whole Super League debacle. Deborah, if there's anyone who's interested in getting involved in the supporters network, do you have any brief advice maybe that they can then look up afterwards?
Yeah, definitely. So if you're interested in setting up a supporters group, you can come and have a chat with me. You can be an individual member of the FSA if you just kind of wanted to keep an eye on the supporters movement and different things that our organisation campaigns for. You can also check to see if you've got a local supporters group and try to communicate with them as much as possible. There's lots of different ways to get involved. I'll pop my email in the chat, so if anybody's got any direct questions, then let me know. And just look out for some activity around the Euros is all I'm going to say, because we're hoping to, in 2019, we set up the first fans embassy service for a women's tournament. So we spoke to absolutely loads of supporters, and we're hoping to help the Football Supporters Europe set up 10 to 12 fan embassy services. So fingers crossed they will be first in the women's game as well, for Spain, France, Sweden, etc. So yeah, I'll drop my email in the chat. Please come chat with me.
Jean, I'm coming to you now. You've already given us insight into some of your incredible work and research over the years. But this question asks, what do you think the best way is to unlock these hidden histories? You mentioned having these meetups with women. Is it that, trying to reach out to people? I don't know, starting a Facebook group asking if anyone's been involved in the women's game, or is it collecting objects this individual writes? Please give us a bit of advice.
Yeah, I suppose all of that, and again, been trying to use the Euros. It's really interesting, actually, because the last time that England hosted the Euros in 2005, a heritage consultant was paid to look at the legacy of what that tournament would be, and for his fee he concluded that there wouldn't be a legacy from that particular tournament, and so there wasn't much of one. But this time it's very different, because if people weren't talking about women's football 20 years ago, they certainly are now. And you can see the likes of Barclays and new sponsors coming in, and so lots of companies are interested in it. So the way to do it is, Facebook and social media, although don't forget a lot of the very older players are digitally excluded, so that's not the only way forward. In-person meetings are important, and reunions have been a really important social strategy, not only to counter, not only for things like contemporary collecting, which is what Belinda's really interested in at the museum, but also to counter social isolation and loneliness. So one of the things that we did during lockdown 1, 2, 3, I don't know, I lost track. We had quite a lot of those reunions on Zoom, and we trained some of the older players to use Zoom so that they could at least stay in contact that way. I'm hoping that with the FA's new strategy around getting women's football to be more social, it doesn't always have to be super competitive, but more social, that at each of the host cities, there will be almost like a walking football tournament with a kind of Antiques Roadshow style event. So come and have a game of walking football with us, and then bring along your memorabilia and talk to us about your career. And I'm hoping that will release a lot of stuff that's in lofts, spare rooms, that kind of stuff, because honestly, this stuff is absolutely gold. And that's the really valuable thing that we have to capture, as well as talking to older players and getting their stories and their memories. And again, Carol's been absolutely brilliant with me, writing stuff for my website, sharing her memorabilia, because if people can see that stuff, they get really excited about it.
It's interesting you just mentioned memorabilia there, because my question for Carol now is actually about that. So Carol, you've been asked, how much has the change in footwear and outfits for the national team and even at club level changed during your time?
Well, everything improved, doesn't it? When I was playing, I was certainly the one to my right here. has been washed and washed again. We didn't have a new kit every match. We had to hand it in and have it washed ready for the next game. We provided our own boots and everything like that. So yeah, it's moved on for the better in a great deal. Yeah.
So of course the theme of today's discussion was 100 years on. At the start of this season, there was this incredible deal struck with Sky, the BBC and the WSL, seeing, I guess, the WSL get closer to what we now know from Jean and Belinda as the heights that women's football once was. Sticking with the theme of 100 years on, I guess I'd love to hear from all of you as kind of your final note. Where would you like to see women's football in 100 years from now? I mean, we may not be here, of course, but in an ideal world, where would you like it to be?
Well, just to keep on improving the way it is doing, and the facilities they've got that I saw at St George's Park last week, soon to be winning World Cups and European Championships, definitely.
I'm going to flip your question. So imagine if in 100 years' time, the whole of the football industry went where women's football was in 1921. So imagine if the whole football industry was played to raise money for charities, and instead of women's football learning from the football industry, what if the football industry learned from women's football? And instead of it making money for dictators and unpleasant regimes around the world, what if all football was played to raise money for charity? Club identity was about a wider social good, and the kind of revolution of sort of thing that Marcus Rashford's trying to do more generally within society about the footballer having a social conscience. What if that was the future of the whole football industry, not just women's football?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think in some ways I don't want women's football to change too much, because there is still that within the women's game, and it'd be a real shame if that gets lost. So if that can be maintained and built upon, then that would be absolutely amazing, in my view, in 100 years' time.
Yeah, I'd have to say a big agree with what you've said there. Providing climate change doesn't wipe us all out before then. You know what? It'd be nice to see women's football keep to what it is. I desperately don't want to see the European Super League style commercialization of the game happen. I think when it comes to midweek and there's a Women's UEFA Champions League game on, I get so excited that I can go onto YouTube and watch so much European football kind of streamed live around the world. That is so magic, and keeping that accessibility point. But actually, as you were saying earlier, Jean, the making it a product that people want to go to, with fans in the stadiums, more than just 100 free tickets for every local primary school, and get it the recognition that it deserves. That's what I want to see, and loads more World Cups for England. It'd be great in that time.
I think I would agree as well. Just as community, keeping the core values of the women's game, making sure that supporters are central to decision making as much as possible, and then also trying to refrain from not going down the rabbit hole of the marketing lens, and always using that optic. So the marketing lens, which can sometimes separate people out, and actually we need to be pulling people together. So it's not, how does a football club market towards the supporters and pull them in? It's working with people and pulling people in, not via always marketing. That would be my hope.
Wow, some food for thought there, I would say. Truly inspiring. I guess we'll see in the next few years whether we get closer to what you've all said you'd like to see in 100 years. So Carol, Jean, Belinda, Liz and Debs, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion on 100 years on. Thank you to everyone who's been with us for the hour. It's been a pleasure having you here on this Thursday evening. Now, of course, remember the actual date in which the 100 years ban took place. It will be on Sunday. The National Football Museum have got an incredible exhibition going on there. So if you'd like any more information about that, visit their website, which I believe will be in the comments section. And similarly, as Deb's mentioned, if you wanted any more information on the Football Supporters Association, she'll be dropping her email in there too. So wishing everyone a very good Thursday evening. And unfortunately, no WSL this weekend, but of course, there is the FA Cup final between Arsenal and Chelsea at Wembley. I'm going to declare my allegiance. I hope Arsenal get the win. But thank you, everyone, again, and have a fantastic evening.